So now we'll hear from David Guston. His work on large-scale collaborations will help add dimension to Jerry's and Laurie's talks.
Great. Thank you very much. As sort of the first discussant, I'm not going to do what academic discussants always do at conferences, which is take on, challenge, show how my stuff is better than your stuff, or dig into the meat of the presentation to find that one little piece that you guys overlooked. No, I'm going to try to do something just a little different than that. There said there were 2 buttons on here. That's great. I found the one button I need. What I really hope to do is first extend a little bit of Laurie's remarks and what I hope to take to be a sympathetic direction that addresses many of the same concerns at a slightly more organizational or institutional level. And then I want to extend Jerry's remarks, probably not as humorously as Jerry managed to do it, which was fabulous, but into a host of other kinds of channels of communication, if you will. And so first I want to talk about a little bit about bridging boundaries and managing interdisciplinarity, and then communicating not internally but externally to a wide variety of audiences. So first, how do we bridge boundaries? And again, here I'm thinking about an institutional level and drawing on work that I participated in that was published in PNAS. I'm sorry for the bad image up there. Published in PNAS in a special issue on sustainability science and knowledge systems for sustainable development back in 2003. And the work overall was led by Bill Clark at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And basically what this work did was it looked at a whole host of what it called global environmental assessments. And this was ranging across not just climate change, but stratospheric ozone and other kinds of global environmental issues. And basically what they developed in the context of that sort of meta-study is that S&T for sustainability is more likely to be effective, that is, be effectively communicated and taken up by policymakers in their making of decisions, when the original work tried to take explicit account of these 3 criteria. 1, salience, which is basically the relevance, is the problem framing, is the research framing done in a way that is relevant to the decision makers. Does it have their questions in mind? Second, credibility. Does it come from a esteemed, august, but clearly communicated kind of scientific background? And third, importantly, legitimacy. Was it put together in a way, was the research put together in a way that represents something that is politically or sociologically legitimate to the actors who are receiving it? Can they understand the array of interests behind it? Can they see that some consideration of political nuance and sensitivity was put into the structuring of the research? So one of the conclusions of that work was effective systems apply a variety of institutional mechanisms that facilitate communication, translation, and mediation across boundaries. The work also drew on earlier work that I had done, and this was really my doctoral work, which oddly enough began in this building. I was a research assistant for the Committee on Science, Engineering, and Public Policy in the midst of my graduate studies, working with, or for Larry McRae, who was then the executive director of COSA-PUP, and Rosemary Chalk and Barry Gold, for a committee on scientific integrity that Ed David was chairing. And it was really a fabulous way of getting into the institutions that mediate between the ones that produce knowledge, like universities, and the ones that consume knowledge, like, say, the US Congress and its agencies. And so I did this study that was eventually published as Between Politics and Science, and I looked at these things called boundary organizations, these entities that exist at this interface between organizations that we want to be making political decisions that we recognize include a set of values as well as technical information, and institutions that we want to be working on the empirical end of things, but facing those other political institutions and doing things that they can end up collaborating on and feeling good about, like sound decision making. And so I characterize these set of institutions that in essence straddled those political and those scientific institutions. And the criteria and definition for these boundary organizations are, first, the opportunity and incentive for using these things that the literature calls boundary objects. There's things that can be used on either side of the boundary to say, hey, I'm finding something of value here, let's work on this thing so that we can collaborate. And some examples of that might be, patents, where in the political world, a patent is an indicator of scientific productivity, bordering on an indicator of economic productivity, where in the scientific world, a patent might be an indicator of actually first to get something done, might be an emblem of another kind of intellectual contribution, but people on both sides of the boundary can recognize that this entity, this boundary object, has some value. And boundary organizations can work together on those objects and take away value to their own respective communities around them. The second important criterion is that boundary organizations involve participation of actors on both sides of the boundaries, as well as mediating professionals. And I want to go back to Alan Leshner's comments in the opening session about the two-way communication that's necessary, that engagement more than communication, or that communication is, in fact, a two-directional activity, to say that we need these fora, we need these organizational structures that allow people from both sides to engage with one another in a somewhat protected space. But we also need the help of additional folks who are skilled at these kinds of communication and at bringing these entities together. That another example of a boundary organization was the late and much lamented Office of Technology Assessment. And one of the critiques of the Office of Technology Assessment was that it didn't allow scientists and politicians to communicate directly, and folks who opposed the Office of Technology Assessment had a vision of this direct engagement between scientists and politicians. Well, sometimes that works, but oftentimes it doesn't. There are mediating structures and mediating activities that need to occur. Finally, boundary organizations have distinct lines of accountability to each side. That is, some of the work has to be recognized as important qua science, and some of the work has to be recognized as important qua politics. We did a lot of work around boundary organizations. We found them in a variety of interesting places. Some other examples: the Health Effects Institute, Agricultural Extension, the International Research Institute for Climate Prediction, and the UN Framework. The basic conclusion here that boundary organizations give both producers and consumers of research an opportunity to construct the boundary, to construct how their domain differs or is similar to the other enterprise in ways that are favorable to their own perspective, and therefore these things may in fact manage to persist over time. You will note that OTA did not persist over time. We could talk about that. Okay, managing interdisciplinarity. At Arizona State University, I was director of a large NSF-funded Center for Nanotechnology and Society. It was characterized by a great deal of internal diversity. I had something like 18 people who were team leaders, associate and assistant directors, and so on and so forth. Of those 18 people were from 14 different PhD disciplines. And we debuted a large number of activities in this interdisciplinary context. And we started in collaborating with scientists and engineers from the side of the social sciences with curricular and extracurricular programs, so that we were able to demonstrate to our science and engineering colleagues that at some level we had the best interests of their students and themselves in mind. And that was an example of an overall strategy that we had in this collaboration, coming from the perhaps lesser established, less esteemed, lower status social sciences, dealing with our natural science and engineering colleagues, that we were going to meet them more than halfway. And we developed a whole host of new modes of communications that I want to spend just my last few seconds talking about. But what I learned in that context was that managing interdisciplinarity is really about building relationships. It's first thinking about how the interaction reflects on what you're doing vis-a-vis the perspective of the person that you're, or the team that you're doing it with. So how do we communicate externally? Whoops. Go back for a second. So in my current role, I'm director of the School for the Future of Innovation Society at ASU. Like the Center for Nanotechnology and Society beforehand, we've got a great deal of internal diversity, and I really can't tell you enough how much the internal diversity means for the next set of activities that I'm going to describe to you. We have 40 faculty bodies, about 30 full-time equivalents, 28 different PhD disciplines, and 5 non-PhD preparations among those bodies. So let that sink in terms of the weirdness that as a director I have to deal with. And so we have among this group a whole host of communicative channels that we're working on that try to take advantage not just of individual faculty members' skills and talents, not just the opportunities in new communications areas, but also the interaction among them and really the concept of going to where the audience is, drawing them in based on their interests. You can read what I otherwise could have read while I was speaking on books, videos, and audios. I'd like to point out that we also work in games, and in particular, the image on the bottom, we work with tarot-like card games that really facilitate that two-way interaction in crowds. We can work with small groups of people within crowds to have a robust discussion, in this case, on the future of the American dream. I want to really drive home something that we heard in the previous conversation as well about informal science education. And here on the top of the slide you can see something called Scribblebot, which is put together with a pool noodle and magic markers for legs, and in the middle of the pool noodle you put an electric toothbrush. So for about $3 you can create a small machine that a child of 8 years old can put together. You turn on the toothbrush, it dances on the table, and you can have a conversation with a child of 8 years old. Is Scribblebot alive? Is what Scribblebot creates art? If Scribblebot created something that was really interesting that somebody wanted to buy it, who would get the money? You were Scribblebot. And if Scribblebot danced on something that was really important and destroyed it, who would be responsible? You were Scribblebot. And I'll just conclude, and there's things that I'm skipping over, but I'll just conclude by saying that a couple weeks ago, reported on the online magazine Quartz, firms are now confronting the problem of if artificial intelligences can create things that those firms want to protect with intellectual property rights, is it worth thinking about those AIs as persons such that they can own that IP? Through Scribblebot, we're having exactly that conversation with 8-year-olds. So fine and performing arts, policy programming, community engagement, 2 ways, be your own transmedia enterprise is really the take-home message. Thank you very much.
Thank you.